Welcome to the Veritas podcast, the weekly show where we study and discuss papal writings of the Catholic Church. Hello, this is Robert Katzman. He's Robert Sisko. This is the Veritas podcast. We are covering Pascendi. Previously, in the last week, we covered paragraph 13, in which we discussed the modernist love for evolving dogma, and we contrasted this with a proper understanding of development of doctrine. Evolving dogma is really a code for changing the beliefs of the church to suit the whims of the modernists or the liberals, however you want to look at it. But according to Father John Hardin, development of doctrine is, quote, the growth in the church's understanding of the truths of divine revelation. So that's where we left off. In this episode, we're going to cover 14 and hopefully some of 15. Pius has been talking about philosophy, and in his systematic style, he moves from this discussion and he looks at how modernists are in practice. In paragraph 14 explains that philosophers can believe in God because it is necessary due to the objective fact of God's existence. When modernists attempt to explain their belief, they simply indicate that their said belief is based on the personal experience of each individual, that the belief comes as some sort of intuition of the heart. And this is a theme we've been discussing. This is their only possible explanation, however, because they've already refused objective truth. But they go further in saying that this experience of theirs surpasses rational experience. Pius then gives an apropos label when he writes, quote, on this head, the modernists differ from the rationalists only to fall into the views of the Protestants and pseudo-mystics, end of quote. And we're going to come back to those words in just a minute. Pius then continues in 14 when he writes, quote, how far this position is removed from that of Catholic teaching. We have already seen how its fallacies have been condemned by the Vatican Council, end of quote. And of course, from the First Vatican Council, a couple of appropriate quotes we'll be discussing, but one in particular is, quote, if anyone says that divine revelation cannot be made credible by external signs, and that therefore men should be drawn to the faith only by their personal internal experience or by private inspiration, let him be anathema. End of quote. Rob, can you pick it up from there?
Yeah, in this encyclical, Pius X considers the modernist under different aspects. He considers the modernist as philosopher, as historian, as believer, as apologist. What he does in 14, he transitions from the modernist as philosopher to the modernist as believer. So I want to summarize what he says here to show how this transition takes place. He says the modernist as philosopher, quote, does recognize the divine as the object of faith, unquote. So in other words, the modernist as philosopher does concede that faith is ordered to God, okay? But then Pius X says God, quote, is only to be found, God is only to be found in the heart of the believer as a feeling and affirmation, unquote. So what he's saying here is, according to the philosopher, God is just the feeling that affirms the existence of God, okay? But then he says, if you ask the modernist as philosopher, if God actually exists independent of this feeling, so yes, the modernist philosophers, yes, the feeling, that's God. But then if you say, well, hold on, is there a God independent of this feeling? Pius X says he won't answer. Okay, the philosopher won't answer that question. So basically, for the modernist as philosopher, the divine, which the philosopher does acknowledge, he acknowledges the existence of the divine, but for the philosopher, the divine may only be a feeling. Okay, so in other words, there's not a personal God, it's just a feeling in the heart for the philosopher. Okay, then he transitions to the modernist as believer, and he says, and this is paragraph 14, he says, if you ask the modernist as believer if God exists independent of the feeling in the heart, he says the believer will affirm, yes, he does exist independent of the feeling of the heart. And then he says this, he says, quote, if you ask the modernist as believer? What foundation this assertion of the believer rests? He answers in the personal experience of the individual. Okay? He then says that, quote, it is this experience which makes a person who acquires it to be properly and truly a believer. So the believer will say, yes, God exists. Well, how do you know God exists? God exists because I feel God. So everything then is based on the feelings for the believer. It's just all based on the feelings. And then he says, you read, that by this method, the modernist as believer falls into the errors of, as he says, quote, the Protestants and pseudo-mystics. And this brings us to, again, back to the charismatic movement. The charismatic movement today is basically just a full flowering of this particular error within the church. For the charismatics, everything is based on experience, the good feelings, being slain in the spirit, the babbling in the tongues, the incoherent gibberish. All those experiences are considered to be an effect of the Holy Ghost, and therefore they're considered to be a sure sign of the Holy Ghost at work. So Pius X said, for the modernist as believer, everything is based on his experience. And if you ask him how he knows that God exists, because of my experience. That's just what we see in the charismatic movement. Everything is based on experience. And if you notice, charismatics talk all the time about the Holy Ghost. They're always talking about the Holy Ghost because they think that their feelings are the Holy Ghost. Their feelings are a manifestation of the Holy Ghost, and therefore their feelings are a confirmation to them of the truth of the charismatic movement. But the problem is, as we mentioned a few episodes ago, these experiences, even these feelings, and even these mystical experiences that sometimes happen, these preternatural experiences, they can easily come from the devil. The devil has the power to produce these experiences, which is proven by the fact that other religions, false religions like the Hindu religion I mentioned a few episodes ago, you also find these same kind of feelings and pseudo-mystical experiences in the false religions. And that is proof positive that these feelings and experiences do not just come from the Holy Ghost. It's proof that the devil can also produce these experiences. But not only that, you can also have just fraudsters or con artists involved in this movement. That reminds me of a story that Jerry Matitix told. Jerry Matitix used to be a Protestant, and while he was a Protestant, he went to a charismatic prayer meeting. It was a Protestant charismatic prayer meeting, and everyone was speaking in tongues, and it came time for Jerry to speak in tongues, and he said he had been studying Hebrew, and he had memorized the 23rd Psalm in Hebrew. So when it came his time to speak in tongues, he just basically recited the 23rd Psalm in Hebrew. But of course, no one else there understood Hebrew, so they thought he was speaking in tongues. And the interesting point is, they had someone there who was supposedly translating. So people are babbling in tongues, and you had the translator there. Well, when Jerry said the 23rd Psalm in Hebrew, the translator translated it. And he translated it as Jerry's saying. He said, God is saying through Jerry that we all need to donate more money so that the pastor can have a new wing built on his house. So obviously these were just fraudsters. And Jerry showed that by saying the 23rd Psalm, which was then interpreted by the guy as saying they should give more money so the pastor of the church could have a new wing built on his house. So the devil can produce these experiences, but it can also come from an unstable person, just going along with emotionalism and doing what he thinks he should do. So it's like we've mentioned in the last few episodes, you have to be really careful with all these experiences. These things are no sure sign of the truth. In fact, they are the errors of the modernists that have been condemned already by Pius X.
And Rob, it's too bad that kind of thing happens Of course, it's not necessarily representative of every single charismatic. Not all of them mean ill will or taking money from somebody. A lot of them, I think, get caught up, like you said, in the moment. They're searching for God because for whatever reason, the way that they're doing it with the 7 sacraments and in their specific parish might not be emotionally adequate for them, and so they're looking. And so sometimes they're the ones getting, conned, as you're alluding to. So it's too bad, but I think there's a psychology going on when these things tend to happen in groups. You never hear of somebody speaking in tongues individually. They're always in groups and group settings, and so there's a lot of kind of peer pressure to do what you watch those sorts of laying on of hands, and people are passing out one after another, but they don't pass out if they're not inside that group setting, and so it's just really kind of sad to see that as well, that they think that that's the hand of God and that God is converting people by having them babble or pass out.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this before, but when I was a kid, I grew up in the Episcopal Church, and we actually were a member of one of the early charismatic Episcopal churches in Houston, Texas. And I went to that church. Now, it wasn't like you have today where people are going, kind of emotional and babbling in tongues. It wasn't to that extent. But we did have, and I felt it myself, the good feelings, and you have these tingling feelings. And, of course, I thought when I was 6 years old, and of course that's the sign of the Holy Ghost, and everyone else thought it. So I actually kind of have some experience in that. And I've talked to my mom later on about this in recent years, and there were these preternatural things taking place. But she's told me later on there was also a lot of weird, really kind of cultish behavior that she wasn't aware of. When she became aware of it, we left that church and joined a new one. But yeah, I did actually attend a Episcopal Charismatic church when I was a kid, probably to about the age of 7 or 8, and we had these experiences. And I'm sure the people were well-meaning, like you said. No one's there intending to, or from what I saw, I know we sure weren't there intending to be involved in anything. So there are, I'm sure, a lot of people of goodwill who just get drawn into this, and then you have the feelings, and wow, this must be God, all these good feelings that we have. So, I agree with you that most people who are involved are probably of goodwill, who are just misled.
And another good question, I think, for all of us to consider is, if the charismatic, and they call it a movement, I think, if the charismatic movement is really the right way to go, then why wasn't it the right way to go in the 1500s or the 1600s or the 1700s? It's a pretty new movement because it's based on a form of Protestantism, as we've talked about several times before. And so it's just kind of strange that a whole new method of interacting or communicating with God, if you will, has just, more recently come to be popular. So it's just unfortunate.
And that's always should be suspect. Whenever something new emerges, novelty is always to be suspect. So you have a new movement, and in addition to being a new movement, you have strange behavior. You have a few episodes ago, I mentioned that they bark like dogs and roll around and laugh uncontrollably. Well, I looked into that after I mentioned our last episode to make sure I had that right. And sure enough, they have, during these charismatic prayer meetings, or whatever they call them, people will be barking like dogs, and they'll be making other animal sounds too, they said. They'll oink like pigs. Sometimes they'll roar like lions. And they actually think this is a manifestation of the Holy Ghost. But if you just step back and use your reason, do you really think you're going to be barking like a dog and oinking, and that's going to be a sign of the Holy Ghost? It's obviously not going to be a sign of the Holy Ghost. So if you just step back, not only is it a novelty, not only is it new, which itself is suspect, now you have people doing this crazy behavior, making animal sounds. Does anyone really think that's going to be of God? If you just think about it, it's clear that it's not.
Okay, well, let's get back to this encyclical. Pius continues, and this is in number 14, quote, "Here it is well to note at once, given this doctrine of experience united with that of symbolism, every religion, even that of paganism, must be held to be true. What is to prevent such experiences from being found in any religion? In fact, they are so maintained by not a few. On what grounds can modernists deny the truth of an experience affirmed by a follower of Islam? Will they claim a monopoly of true experiences for Catholics alone? Indeed, modernists do not deny, but actually maintain, some confusedly, others frankly, that all religions are true. That they cannot feel otherwise is obvious. For on what ground, according to their theories, could falsity be predicated on any religion whatsoever? Certainly it would be either on account of the falsity of the religious sense, or on an account of the falsity of the formula pronounced by the mind. End of quote. Pius is excellent. He simply stated the logical conclusion one would arrive at if that person comes from modernist philosophy. He's speaking of ecumenism, Rob. He's saying that if you're an honest modernist, then you can't condemn or say that any other belief is wrong.
Yep. See, we're seeing the danger and the bad effects of this error. One error is almost always going to result in more errors. Once you get a false premise, an error in the mind, then you're going to start drawing false conclusions. It's going to lead into other errors. And so if a person considers these experiences as a sign of the Holy Ghost and a confirmation of the truth, how then can they claim that the followers of other religions, when they experience these things, that these religions aren't also true, because these members of these religions have these same experiences? They're forced to conclude, well, I guess maybe the Holy Ghost is at work in those religions too, because experiences, that's a sign of God working, and I see the Hindus or the Muslims having these experiences, so I guess their religion's true also. It leads, like you said, to ecumenism, and it also leads to religious indifferentism. Religious indifferentism is the error that considers all religions to be true, just various scales of truth, or at least considers the religions to be good enough for salvation. So indifferentism, there's not one true religion, the Catholic religion, all the other religions are false. No, they're all just different variations of the truth. They're all good enough for salvation. Maybe some are better, but you can be saved in all religions. And Pope Gregory the 16th, he referred to this error of indifferentism as a deadly error. And why is it a deadly error? It's a deadly error because it leads to the denial of the dogma that outside the church there's no salvation, which is a defined dogma that Catholics are bound in faith to accept. And indifferentism also, what it also does is places the true religion, the religion established by God, God incarnate, on the same level as false religions founded by men in opposition to the true religion. This is what Gregory the 16th said that I was referring to about religious indifferentism. This comes from the encyclical Mirari Vos. This is what he said. Quote, "Now we consider another abundant source of the evils with which the Church is afflicted at present, indifferentism. This perverse opinion is spread on all sides by the fraud of the wicked, who claim that it is possible to obtain the eternal salvation of the soul by the profession of any kind of religion, as long as morality is maintained. Surely, he says, in so clear a matter, you will drive this deadly error far from the people committed to your care, with the admonition of the apostle that there is, quote, one God, one faith, one baptism, unquote. May those fear who contrive the notion that the safe harbor of salvation is open to persons of any religion whatever. They should consider the testimony of Christ himself that those who are not with Christ are against him, and that they disperse unhappily who do not gather with him. Therefore, without a doubt, they will perish forever, unless they hold the Catholic faith whole and inviolate, unquote." But this error of religious indifferentism, it is everywhere today. It's everywhere in the church today, in large part due to modernism, which has also infected the church from top to bottom.
And you're right when we're talking about from top to bottom. In number 14, Pius concludes, and he's talking about this idea of modernists, and he ends this paragraph this way, quote, "But what is most amazing is that there are Catholics and priests who, we would fain believe, abhor such enormities, and yet act as if they fully approved of them. For they lavish such praise and bestow such public honor on the teachers of these errors, as to convey the belief that their admiration is not meant merely for the persons, who are perhaps not devoid of a certain merit, but rather for the sake of the errors which these persons openly profess, in which they do all in their power to propagate." End of quote.
Yeah, the modernists, they do stick together. That's one thing about them. They stick together. They promote their own. You don't have really the division within the modernists that you do within the Catholics. They stick together. That's because the devil is not seeking to divide those who are following him. So they stick together. They promote their own. And then in the next paragraph, paragraph 15, Pius X explains how modernists, they pervert the true notion of tradition. And the word tradition refers to the passing down or the receiving of what has been passed down to us. So everything that has come down to us from the time of the apostles is part of tradition. So you have the early creeds of the church, that's part of tradition. You have all the teachings of the magisterium. You have all the errors that have been condemned. Those form part of tradition. All the definitive teachings of the councils, those all form part of tradition. It's what we have received from the past. That's tradition. That's what tradition is. So tradition is all that we have received, all the definitive teachings of the magisterium. But as Pius X explains, for the modernists, tradition is simply the communication with others of an original experience. You see, it's not all that has been received, all that's been definitively taught by the church. It's people getting together, and I have an experience, so I share my experience with you, and that's actually tradition, sharing the experiences. This is what Pius X said in paragraph 15. He said, quote, "There is yet another element in this part of their teaching which is absolutely contrary to Catholic truth. For what is laid down as to experience is also applied with destructive effect to tradition, which has always been maintained by the Catholic Church. Tradition, as understood by the modernists, is a communication with others of an original experience through preaching by means of the intellectual formula." Unquote. So based on this false idea, tradition is not something external that's passed down to us, but it comes from within man like everything else. According to the modernists, tradition, it comes about by man having experience and then sharing his personal experience with others. That's where tradition comes from. That's tradition for modernists. They have a false notion of tradition.
And that goes back to a point we've made several episodes ago, quoting Pius, talking about modernists use some of the same words and same vocabulary, but they don't really mean the same thing that we do. And that's how some good, well-intentioned people can fall prey to not just these feelings in the charismatic movement we've been talking about today, but just all the errors of modernism. They use sly language, and so that's another unfortunate thing. That's a good place to stop, Rob. We'll end it here. Next time, we'll move on to paragraph 16 and 17, maybe even 18. We'll go from there. Join us next time. Read through the encyclical ahead of time if you want to listen with us. We're doing about 2 or 3 paragraphs at a time as of now.